Move, old man. Some of us have places to be." The words cut through the peaceful morning air as 85-year-old Commander Franklin Hayes, USN retired, felt his wheelchair suddenly jerk sideways, tipping precariously as a muscular young man deliberately shouldered past him on the narrow boardwalk. Franklin's weathered hands gripped the armrests tightly, his steel blue eyes flashing not with fear, but with the controlled fury of a man who had once commanded elite warriors in the world's most dangerous waters. The young bully and his friends laughed, continuing their path of casual destruction down the pier. 18 minutes later, the rumble of high-performance engines and the silhouettes of black tactical vehicles converged on the marina. A Navy SEAL element establishing silent, lethal dominance. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Commander Franklin "Frank" Hayes had not always relied on the sleek titanium wheelchair that now carried him through his twilight years. For most of his 8 decades, he had stood tall, a commanding presence in the United States Navy, where he had served with distinction for 35 years. His career had taken him from the humid jungles of Vietnam as a young SEAL officer to the command of special operations across the globe, earning him the respect of America's most elite warriors and a chest full of medals he never displayed. Now at 85, his once powerful frame had been diminished by age and the accumulated toll of injuries sustained in service. His legs, damaged during a classified operation in waters no American was officially supposed to navigate, had finally failed. 2 years ago, the wheelchair, custom-built by a former SEAL who now designed adaptive equipment for wounded warriors, had become his constant companion. Yet Frank carried himself with the same quiet dignity he had always possessed. His silver hair was still cut in the same neat military style he'd worn for decades, his clothes always pressed and precise. Though his body had weakened, his mind remained razor-sharp, his eyes missing nothing, a lifetime of situational awareness impossible to surrender. Home for Frank was a modest beachfront cottage in Coronado, California, not far from where he had once trained generations of Navy SEALs. He had chosen to retire there, comforted by the constant rhythm of the waves and the occasional distant sounds of training from the naval base. His days followed a comfortable routine: morning coffee on his accessible deck overlooking the Pacific, reading intelligence journals and newspapers, a mid-morning roll along the boardwalk for exercise, and afternoons spent either writing his memoirs or mentoring young sailors and SEALs who sought his wisdom. His wife, Margaret, his anchor through 55 years of marriage and deployments, had passed 3 years ago. Their photos lined the walls of his home, Margaret in her nurse's uniform when they'd first met at a naval hospital, their wedding day with Frank in his dress whites, snapshots with their son Thomas, who had followed his father into the Navy and now commanded a destroyer in the Pacific Fleet. Frank lived alone, fiercely independent despite his disability, refusing the full-time care his son regularly offered to arrange. His cottage was meticulously organized, everything within reach, adapted for his new reality without surrendering to it. Neighbors knew him as a quiet but friendly presence, always ready with a wave or a nod, occasionally sharing fascinating stories over a glass of bourbon on his deck if they were fortunate enough to be invited. Most knew of his military service, though few knew the full extent of his classified operations or the true impact he had made on America's special warfare community. The boardwalk incident occurred on a bright Tuesday morning in May, the kind of perfect California day that drew tourists and locals alike to the waterfront. Frank had completed half of his usual route, nodding politely to familiar faces, pausing occasionally to watch seabirds or admire passing boats. The marina was moderately busy, a mixture of tourists, joggers and fishermen preparing their boats for the day. A group of 5 young men in their 20s had been trailing behind Frank for several minutes, their loud voices and aggressive demeanor creating an invisible wave of disturbance. Other pedestrians subtly moved aside, giving them a wide berth. They were muscular, tattooed, clearly regular gym-goers, wearing expensive athletic wear and projecting an air of entitled arrogance. Their leader, a tall man with a tribal tattoo snaking up his neck and a perpetual sneer, would later be identified as Derek Winters, son of a wealthy local developer. Frank had noted their presence with the same automatic threat assessment he'd performed countless times in hostile territory. He adjusted his path to stay clear, positioning his wheelchair closer to the railing that separated the boardwalk from the beach below. He had no desire for confrontation. His days of battle were long behind him. As the group drew closer, their conversation grew louder, deliberately provocative. "Look at these pathetic old people, man," Derek's voice carried. "Wasting space, rolling around, slowing everyone down." His companions chuckled, emboldened by their leader's cruelty. Frank continued forward, his face impassive, his hands steady on the wheels of his chair. He had weathered far worse than the taunts of undisciplined young men, but Derek, perhaps irritated by Frank's stoic non-reaction, decided to escalate. As the group passed Frank, Derek deliberately veered toward him, his shoulder connecting forcefully with the back of the wheelchair. The impact was calculated, just enough to destabilize, but not completely topple the chair. "Move, old man. Some of us have places to be," Derek sneered, as Frank's wheelchair lurched sideways, one wheel momentarily hanging over the edge of the boardwalk. Only Frank's quick reflexes and upper body strength, still impressive despite his age, prevented a dangerous fall down to the sand several feet below. "Whoa, better get a license for that thing," another young man jeered, high-fiving Derek as the group continued past, laughing at their own cruelty. Frank stabilized his chair, his heart racing not from fear, but from a surge of controlled anger he hadn't felt since combat. For a brief moment, muscle memory from decades of special operations took over, calculating distances, analyzing vulnerabilities, planning swift, decisive action. His hands tightened on his wheels, knuckles white. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But wisdom tempered the warrior instinct. He was not that man anymore, and these were not enemy combatants, merely foolish, disrespectful civilians. He took a deep breath, centering himself as he had been trained to do. Under far more dire circumstances, a middle-aged couple who had witnessed the incident hurried over, concern etched on their faces. "Are you all right, sir?" the woman asked, her hand hovering uncertainly near his shoulder. "Those jerks! We should call the police." "Thank you, but I'm fine," Frank replied, his voice calm and measured, betraying none of the cold calculation happening behind his eyes. "No harm done." "But they could have seriously injured you," the man protested. "They nearly pushed you." "Off the boardwalk," Frank offered a small, enigmatic smile. "I appreciate your concern, truly, but I believe in appropriate responses to situations. This will be handled." The couple exchanged puzzled glances but didn't press further. Something, in the old veteran's tone, suggesting he was not a man to be underestimated, wheelchair or not. They helped him straighten his chair, made sure he was stable, then continued on their way, glancing back with lingering concern. Frank watched the group of young men continue down the boardwalk, noting their trajectory toward a trendy beachfront bar that was just opening for the day. They were still laughing, already recounting their prank to each other with exaggerated gestures. They clearly expected no consequences for their actions. Expectations, Frank knew from decades of combat experience, could be fatally misleading. He finished his route, maintaining his dignity and composure, acknowledging greetings from other regulars on the boardwalk who had no idea of the incident that had just occurred. When he returned to his cottage, he rolled directly to his study, a room few civilians had ever entered. The study was both a testament to his naval career and a fully functional command center. Photographs in simple frames documented operations in places most Americans couldn't locate on a map. Bookshelves held volumes on military history, strategy, and leadership, many written by men he had trained or commanded. A specialized computer system, far more sophisticated than might be expected in a retiree's home, sat on a desk adapted for wheelchair access. Frank positioned himself at the desk, considering his options carefully. What had happened wasn't merely about him. It was about respect for the vulnerable, for the elderly, for veterans who had given parts of themselves to their country. It was about a social contract that seemed increasingly fragile in modern America. In his long career, Frank had learned that proportional response was key. Overwhelming force applied with precision when necessary, restraint when possible. This situation called for education, not elimination, a lesson, not vengeance. He reached for a secure phone that few civilians knew existed and even fewer had access to. It connected him directly to the Naval Special Warfare Command, where, despite his retired status, his name still opened doors and commanded immediate attention. Certain protocols never expired for men of his standing. Special Warfare Command, Lieutenant Commander Wilson speaking, came the crisp response after just one ring. Wilson, this is Commander Hayes, Frank Hayes. His voice carried the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without needing to raise his volume. There was a brief pause on the other end. Commander Hayes, sir, it's an honor. How can Special Warfare assist you today? I need to report an incident requiring a community relations intervention and an educational opportunity regarding respect for disabled veterans. Targeted response, not general display. Frank's choice of words was deliberate, using terminology that would be immediately understood within the special operations community. He provided succinct details, the location, description of the young men, their current whereabouts at the beachfront bar, and the nature of the incident. He emphasized the educational aspect multiple times. Understood completely, Commander, Wilson replied, his tone suggesting he grasped both the spoken and unspoken elements of the request. Given your location and the target venue, I believe Training Group 3 is currently conducting urban navigation exercises in your vicinity. I'll redirect an element for this. Educational opportunity. Appropriate resources only. Completely discreet. Thank you, Lieutenant Commander. I trust your judgment on the appropriate response team. Time frame, sir? Frank considered for a moment. The lesson will be more effective if delivered promptly. These young men appear to be settling in for extended drinking at the sandbar. Understood, sir. Expect contact within 20 minutes. Will you be available if the situation commander needs to consult? I'll be on my deck, overlooking the marina. They'll see me. The call ended with efficient brevity. Frank wheeled himself to his deck, positioned his chair for optimal visibility of both the marina and the beachfront bar where the young men had gone. He poured himself a small measure of bourbon, an exceptional single barrel reserved for significant occasions, and waited. Precisely 18 minutes after his call, the response began with subtle precision that would be invisible to casual observers but was unmistakable to Frank's trained eye. First came the discreet positioning of observers. 2 men and a woman in civilian beach attire who established surveillance points around the sandbar. To ordinary people, they appeared to be nothing more than attractive beachgoers enjoying the day. But Frank noted their strategic positioning, the slight bulges of concealed communications equipment, the way they established overlapping fields of view while appearing completely casual, Next, two unmarked black suburban SUVs with government plates and darkened windows pulled into the marina parking area, followed by a civilian pickup truck carrying what appeared to be diving equipment, but could easily conceal tactical gear. The vehicles parked in positions that effectively controlled access to the area without appearing to do so. From these vehicles emerged 8 men in civilian clothes, though their bearing, haircuts and physiques immediately identified them as military to Frank's experienced eye. They moved with the controlled, purposeful efficiency that separated special operators from ordinary personnel. Their casual clothes couldn't disguise the coiled readiness of men who had spent years honing their bodies into precision instruments. The leader was immediately apparent to Frank, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 30s with the weathered face of someone who had seen too much sun and too many operations. He moved with quiet authority, giving subtle hand signals to his team that deployed them around the perimeter of the bar in a textbook containment formation. Frank recognized him with a small smile of satisfaction. Lieutenant Commander Jason Reeves, a decorated SEAL team leader whose grandfather had served under Frank decades ago. The response team had been chosen with deliberate care, not just any SEAL element, but one with personal connections to Frank's legacy. Lieutenant Commander Reeves made brief eye contact with Frank across the distance, offering an almost imperceptible nod of respect before turning his attention to the sandbar. He approached the establishment alone, his team now invisibly positioned but unquestionably present. The young men, including Derek, had claimed a prime table on the deck overlooking the water. They were already several drinks in, growing louder and more obnoxious, harassing the waitress with inappropriate comments and intimidating other patrons with their boisterous behavior. They were completely oblivious to the net that had silently closed around them. Reeves entered the bar, spoke briefly with the manager, who seemed immediately relieved by whatever identification Reeves discreetly displayed, and then walked directly to the young men's table, positioning himself strategically to control the space. Even from his deck, Frank could see the immediate change in the atmosphere. Conversations nearby quieted as people instinctively sensed the shift in power dynamics. The young men, initially annoyed at the interruption, quickly registered something in Reeves' bearing that pierced through their alcohol-fueled bravado. "Gentlemen," Reeves began, his voice carrying across the water to where Frank sat, "I'd like a moment of your time to discuss an incident that occurred on the boardwalk approximately 30 minutes ago, involving a disabled veteran in a wheelchair." Derek, still operating under the mistaken belief that his father's influence protected him from all consequences, attempted to dismiss the interruption. "Don't know what you're talking about, man. We're just having drinks here." Reeves smiled, a smile Frank recognized from his own days, commanding men in hostile territory. It was not a smile that suggested amusement. "Mr. Winters," Reeves said, using Derek's name without having been told it, "I believe you do know, just as you know that your father's development company is currently bidding on 3 federal contracts that require security clearance approval." Interesting coincidence. The color drained from Derek's face. His companions shifted uncomfortably, suddenly very sober. "Now, as I was saying," Reeves continued, pulling up a chair uninvited and sitting with the relaxed confidence of a man who knew exactly how many ways he could incapacitate everyone at the table if necessary, "we need to discuss your interaction with Commander Franklin Hayes, United States Navy, retired." The young men at the table froze, their earlier bravado evaporating like morning dew under a harsh sun. Derek, his face now pale beneath his expensive tan, glanced nervously at his friends who suddenly seemed very interested in their drinks. Commander Hayes?" Derek repeated, his voice catching slightly. Something in Reeves's tone had cut through his alcohol-fueled confidence, leaving a creeping sense of dread in its place. "Commander Franklin Hayes," Reeves confirmed, his voice deceptively casual as he leaned back in his chair. 35 years of distinguished service, former commanding officer of SEAL Team 2, veteran of 3 wars, recipient of the Navy Cross, Silver Star, and Bronze Star with Valor. A man who at your age had already saved the lives of 14 fellow sailors during an operation I'm still not cleared to discuss in detail. Reeves paused, letting the weight of those accomplishments settle over the increasingly uncomfortable group. Around them, other patrons had gone quiet, listening with growing interest. A man who, despite now requiring a wheelchair due to injuries sustained defending this country, still conducts himself with more dignity in a single moment than you've managed to display in your entire lives. One of Derek's friends, a slightly less intoxicated young man with a suddenly ashen face, spoke up. "Look, we didn't know who he was, and that matters how." Reeves cut him off, his voice still conversational, but carrying an edge sharp enough to draw blood. "Would it have been acceptable to harass and endanger any elderly person in a wheelchair? Is your respect contingent on knowing someone's service record?" The young man withered under Reeves's gaze, slumping back in his chair. Derek, attempting to reclaim some authority, straightened his shoulders. "Listen, who exactly are you? You can't just come in here and—" "Lieutenant Commander Jason Reeves, United States Navy," Reeves interrupted smoothly, still not bothering to show identification. "Currently assigned to Naval Special Warfare Group. My team is conducting a community relations exercise focused on respect for veterans and appropriate civilian behavior. You've been selected as participants." As if on cue, 2 more SEALs in civilian clothes appeared silently behind the young men, their presence alone creating an atmosphere of controlled intensity. They didn't speak, didn't touch anyone. They simply stood, radiating the quiet, focused power that comes from men who have mastered themselves before attempting to master others. "Participants," Derek echoed, his earlier sneer replaced by growing apprehension as he noticed the new arrivals. "What does that mean?" Reeves smiled again, a gesture that didn't reach his eyes. "It means you gentlemen are about to receive an education in several areas: the consequences of your actions, the value of service, and the proper way to treat those who have sacrificed for this country." He stood with fluid grace. "You have 2 options. Option 1, you come with us voluntarily for this educational opportunity, which will include a personal apology to Commander Hayes and community service under our supervision. Option 2, we can discuss your actions today with the local police, who I'm sure would be interested in charges of elder abuse, assault, and public intoxication. Those charges might complicate your futures, especially yours, Mr. Winters, given your father's pending federal contracts." The threat was delivered with such calm precision that it took a moment for the young men to fully process it. When they did, the last vestiges of their arrogance crumbled. "We'll come with you," Derek muttered, unable to meet Reeves's steady gaze. "Excellent choice," Reeves replied. "Please settle your tab generously, including an appropriate apology to your server for your previous behavior. My men will escort you outside." As Derek fumbled with his wallet, leaving far too much cash on the table, Reeves stepped away to make a brief call. "Sir, educational process initiated. Participants have elected for voluntary compliance. Proceeding to Phase 2. We'll be at your location in approximately 15 minutes. Across the marina, on his deck, Frank acknowledged the update with a small nod that only a trained observer would have noticed. He finished his bourbon, savoring the warmth that spread through his chest, a warmth that came not from the alcohol, but from the knowledge that certain values still held firm in a world that sometimes seemed to have forgotten them. The young men were escorted from the bar with quiet efficiency, surrounded by SEALs who maintained a professional distance but whose very presence created an inescapable perimeter. They were directed to walk along the boardwalk, the same path where they had accosted Frank earlier, now experiencing the route from a very different perspective. Other beachgoers noticed the procession with curious glances. The SEALs, despite their civilian clothes, carried themselves with unmistakable military bearing, creating a bubble of authority around the subdued young men. Local police officers patrolling the area nodded respectfully to Reeves as they passed, clearly aware of and approving what was happening. During this walk of shame, Reeves walked beside Derek, speaking in a low voice that only the young man could hear. The SEAL's words were measured, neither threatening nor berating, but delivered with the steady conviction of a man who had seen the best and worst of humanity in the crucible of combat. "You know, the truly remarkable thing about men like Commander Hayes," Reeves said, "is not just what they endured, but what they chose not to become because of it. The Commander has seen and experienced things that would break most people, yet he chose to channel that experience into leadership, into mentoring generations of sailors, into making his community better." Derek kept his eyes fixed on the boardwalk ahead, but his posture had changed, the cockiness replaced by something approaching shame. "The wheelchair you so casually disrupted today, that's the result of injuries sustained during an operation where the Commander led a team into hostile waters to rescue American hostages, including civilians like yourself. He took 3 bullets protecting a young sailor, then continued to command the extraction while bleeding out. That sailor later became an admiral. I know because that sailor was my grandfather." Derek's step faltered briefly. "The Commander never talks about it," Reeves continued. "He doesn't wear his medals or demand recognition. His reward was knowing he served with honor, that he protected his men and his country. That quiet dignity you mocked today? That's the mark of true strength, something you've clearly never understood." As they approached Frank's cottage, the young men grew visibly more nervous. The modest beachfront home, with its weathered wood, exterior and wheelchair ramp, seemed suddenly imposing, a gateway to accountability they had never expected to face. Frank was waiting on his deck, his wheelchair positioned with a clear view of their approach. Despite his age and physical limitations, he projected an aura of natural command that made several of the young men instinctively straighten their posture. His weathered face remained impassive, evaluating without revealing his thoughts. Reeves led the group up the ramp to the deck, positioning them in a line facing Frank. The other SEALs maintained a perimeter, professional and alert, creating a space where excuses and evasions would find no purchase. "Commander Hayes," Reeves said, his tone shifting to one of deep respect, "as requested, we've brought these young men for the educational opportunity you proposed. They've agreed to participate voluntarily." Frank studied each face carefully before speaking. When he finally did, his voice was surprisingly gentle, though it carried the unmistakable weight of authority. "Thank you, Lieutenant Commander Reeves. Exemplary response time." He wheeled himself forward slightly, addressing the young men directly. "I imagine this afternoon is not proceeding as you planned. Try to stay to Derek, designated by circumstance and his earlier leadership in cruelty as the spokesman, struggled to find his voice. "Sir, I want to apologize for what happened on the boardwalk. We didn't know who you were." Frank raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "That is precisely the problem, young man. You assumed you knew everything worth knowing about me based on my age and disability." His blue eyes, still sharp as a tactical blade, held Derek's gaze. "Just as I could assume everything worth knowing about you based on one moment of poor judgment. Would that be fair?" The question hung in the air, rhetorical, yet demanding internal reflection. "I didn't ask Lieutenant Commander Reeves to bring you here for an apology," Frank continued. "Apologies are just words, unless backed by changed behavior and understanding. I asked for an educational opportunity, for you certainly, but perhaps more importantly, for others who might benefit from observing the consequences of disrespect." He gestured toward the marina, where curious onlookers had gathered at a respectful distance, drawn by the unusual sight of the SEAL team and their clearly chastened charges. "Leadership isn't about how you treat those you need to impress," Frank said. "It's about how you treat those who can do nothing for you. It's about the standards you maintain when you think no one who matters is watching." Frank wheeled himself to a small table on his deck, where a stack of books sat alongside several large photo albums. "Before we proceed to the more physical portion of today's education, I'd like you to understand something about judgment and its consequences." He opened one of the albums, revealing photographs that spanned decades. Frank as a young SEAL officer, leading men through jungle operations, receiving medals, standing aboard naval vessels in distant waters. There were photos of humanitarian missions, of training evolutions, of solemn memorial services for fallen comrades. "I've spent my life judging men, evaluating their character, their potential, their trustworthiness in situations where mistakes meant death. I've sent men into combat knowing some wouldn't return. I've made decisions that altered the course of operations and lives." His voice remained steady, matter-of-fact rather than boastful. That responsibility required looking beyond surfaces, beyond first impressions, beyond easy assumptions. He fixed Derek with a penetrating stare. "Today, you judge me as nothing more than an obstacle, an inconvenience, something to be pushed aside for your momentary amusement. Your judgment was flawed, not just morally but practically, and poor judgment has consequences." Frank nodded to Reeves, who stepped forward with military precision. "The physical portion of today's education will consist of 3 components," Reeves announced. "First, each of you will spend 1 hour in a wheelchair, navigating the boardwalk and marina under the supervision of my team, experiencing firsthand the challenges Commander Hayes faces daily." The young men exchanged uneasy glances. "Second, you will participate in a beach cleanup operation covering the entire waterfront area, wearing weighted vests to simulate the physical limitations of aging and injury." Reeves paused, allowing that to sink in before delivering the final component. "Finally, you will each write a 5-page reflection on what you've learned today, to be presented to Commander Hayes and to a group of wounded warriors at the Naval Medical Center tomorrow morning." Derek opened his mouth as if to protest, then closed it, the reality of his situation finally penetrating completely. This wasn't something he could buy, charm, or bully his way out of. This wasn't something his father's influence could make disappear. "Sir," he finally said to Frank, his voice stripped of its earlier arrogance, "I understand." Frank studied him for a long moment. "No, you don't. Not yet. But that's the purpose of education, to replace ignorance with understanding. Lieutenant Commander Reeves and his team are excellent teachers, and you'll find their methods quite memorable." On cue, additional SEALs appeared, rolling 5 wheelchairs onto the deck. Another team member arrived with a collection of weighted vests designed to restrict movement and simulate physical limitations. "Before you begin," Frank said, "I want to tell you about the man who designed this wheelchair." He patted the titanium frame of his own chair. "Chief Petty Officer Marcus Rivera lost both legs to an IED in Afghanistan. Instead of surrendering to bitterness, he founded a company creating adaptive equipment for disabled veterans. His designs have helped hundreds of wounded warriors regain independence." Frank's expression softened slightly. "He's also the godfather of my grandson, who is currently serving as a hospital corpsman with a Marine unit overseas. The world is smaller than you think, gentlemen. The connections that bind us, particularly in the military community, run deeper than you can imagine." He gestured to the wheelchairs waiting for them. "Those are Rivera's designs as well. He donated them specifically for educational purposes like this. You'll find them precisely as challenging to maneuver as they need to be for today's lesson. The young men were directed to the wheelchairs, where they awkwardly seated themselves under the watchful eyes of the SEALs. Their discomfort was evident, not just physical discomfort, but the deeper discomfort of men confronting the consequences of their actions, perhaps for the first time in their privileged lives. Reeves provided brief, military-precise instructions on wheelchair operation before announcing, "Your first task will be to navigate to the public restroom at the far end of the boardwalk and back without assistance. This is a task Commander Hayes performs daily. You have 45 minutes to complete what takes him 15. As the young men struggled with their unfamiliar conveyances, Frank watched with an experienced eye. He wasn't seeking revenge or humiliation, concepts alien to his leadership philosophy. He was witnessing the beginning of something far more valuable, understanding born from experience. "They'll find it educational," he remarked to Reeves, who had remained behind momentarily. "Undoubtedly, sir," Reeves replied. "My team will ensure the lesson is thoroughly absorbed." Frank nodded, satisfied. "Your grandfather would be proud of the officer you've become, Jason." Reeves's professional demeanor softened briefly. "Thank you, sir. He always said everything he became as a leader he learned from you." As Reeves departed to supervise the education in progress, Frank remained on his deck, watching the awkward procession of wheelchairs making their way down the boardwalk, each accompanied by a SEAL who observed without assisting, allowing natural consequences to serve as the primary instructor. Frank reflected on the long arc of his career, on the generations of sailors he had trained and influenced, on the ripple effects of leadership that continued long after one's active service had ended. Today was another form of service, different from combat operations but no less important, teaching respect, accountability, and the true meaning of strength to young men who had never been properly introduced to these concepts. The remainder of the afternoon unfolded according to Reeves's precisely orchestrated plan. The young men struggled through their wheelchair navigation, encountering firsthand the challenges of ramps, doorways, and the subtle but constant scrutiny of able-bodied people. Their frustration was evident, but so too was the dawning recognition in their eyes as they began to understand the daily reality of someone like Frank. Next came the beach cleanup in weighted vests, conducted under the relentless California sun. The SEALs maintained a pace just challenging enough to be uncomfortable without being dangerous, pushing the young men to experience physical limitations they had never considered. Local beachgoers watched with curiosity, many recognizing the military precision of the operation and offering approving nods as they realized its purpose. Throughout these activities, the SEALs provided context rather than criticism. They shared stories of wounded warriors who had overcome far greater challenges than a few hours in a wheelchair or a weighted vest. They spoke of resilience, adaptation, and the true definition of strength, not as domination over others, but as mastery over oneself. By late afternoon, when they returned to Frank's deck for the final phase of their education, the young men were physically exhausted, but mentally awakened. They sat at the table where Frank had arranged paper and pens for their reflections, their earlier arrogance replaced by thoughtful silence. "Before you begin writing," Frank said, "I want to share something with you." He opened another album, this one filled with more recent photographs, Frank in his wheelchair at veterans events, mentoring young sailors, surrounded by children, at a school presentation, fishing from an adapted boat. "After my injuries progressed to the point where this chair became necessary," he explained, "I had a choice. I could surrender to bitterness over what I had lost, or I could adapt and continue, serving in new ways. Every day that choice presents itself again. Every morning I choose to roll forward rather than look backward." He fixed each young man with a steady gaze. The measure of a person isn't found in physical capability or social status or financial resources. It's found in how you respond to challenges, how you treat others, especially those you perceive as having no power over you." Frank wheeled himself away from the table. "You have 1 hour to reflect on today's experiences. Lieutenant Commander Reeves will provide transportation to the Naval Medical Center tomorrow morning, where you'll read your reflections to a group of recently injured service members undergoing rehabilitation." He paused, allowing the significance of that audience to sink in. They are the true recipients of today's education. Your experience will become a teaching tool for them, an example of how the civilian world can both fail and rise to meet its obligations to those who serve. As Frank moved toward his door, Derek suddenly spoke up. "Commander Hayes, sir, why did you do this? You could have had us arrested. You could have ruined our records, our futures." Frank turned his wheelchair, regarding the young man thoughtfully. "Because punishment creates resentment, while education creates understanding. Because my goal was never to destroy your future, but to enhance it. And perhaps, through you, to improve the future for other veterans who will wheel down that boardwalk long after I'm gone." His expression softened slightly. "And because many years ago, a wise commander gave a young, arrogant SEAL officer a similar lesson when he needed it, rather than ending his career over a mistake. That officer was me. The capacity to learn and grow is what separates a momentary failure from a failed life." With that, Frank entered his home, leaving the young men to their reflections under the watchful eyes of Reeves and his team. As the sun began to set over the Pacific, casting golden light across the marina, 5 young men who had begun the day as thoughtless bullies sat writing intently, occasionally glancing up at the wheelchair tracks on the deck, visible reminders of both the man they had disrespected and the lesson they would never forget. Inside his home, Frank made a phone call to his son on the destroyer in the Pacific, sharing the day's events with quiet satisfaction. "The SEALs still remember how to make a point," he concluded with a small chuckle. "Did you ever doubt they would, Dad?" his son replied. "After all, you trained half their instructors." The following morning dawned clear and bright over Coronado, the early light casting long shadows across the naval base where generations of America's elite warriors had been forged. At precisely 800, 2 black suburban SUVs pulled up outside Frank's cottage. Lieutenant Commander Reeves, now in his crisp naval uniform adorned with the SEAL trident and combat ribbons, stepped onto the porch and knocked with military precision. Frank answered promptly, dressed in a tailored navy blue blazer with a small naval special warfare pin on the lapel, pressed khakis and polished shoes. Despite his wheelchair, he projected the unmistakable aura of command that decades of leadership had instilled in him. His silver hair was neatly trimmed, his face freshly shaved, his bearing impeccable. "Good morning, Commander," Reeves said, offering a respectful nod that stopped just short of a formal salute, acknowledging both Frank's retired status and his continued standing in the SEAL community. "Lieutenant Commander," Frank replied, warmly, "I see you've brought our educational participants." The 5 young men emerged from the vehicles, transformed from the arrogant group of yesterday. They were clean-shaven, wearing pressed slacks and button-down shirts, clearly purchased for the occasion. Their demeanor had shifted dramatically. Gone was the swaggering entitlement, replaced by a subdued attentiveness that suggested the previous day's lessons had penetrated more deeply than expected. Derek, who had once sneered at Frank's disability, now approached the ramp to Frank's deck with visible hesitation, his eyes taking in the incline with new understanding after his experience in the wheelchair. When he reached Frank, he extended his hand without prompting. "Commander Hayes, thank you for the opportunity to learn from yesterday's experience," he said, his voice steady but humbled. "I've completed my reflection as assigned." Frank accepted the handshake, noting the firmness of the grip, not the excessive pressure of someone trying to dominate, but the proper respect of equals. "I look forward to hearing it, Mr. Winters," he replied. Each of the other young men followed suit, offering respectful greetings and presenting their written reflections in folders they held carefully, as if the contents were valuable documents rather than assigned essays. Frank received each with the same dignified acknowledgement, neither condemning nor prematurely absolving. His leadership experience had taught him that true change revealed itself through sustained action, not momentary contrition. "Before we depart for the medical center," Frank said, addressing the group, "I want you to understand the significance of where we're going and who you'll be meeting." He wheeled himself to the edge of his deck, positioning his chair to face the naval base visible across the bay. The young men gathered around him, their attention focused with an intensity absent in yesterday's initial encounter. "The men and women you'll meet today are at the beginning of journeys similar to mine," Frank explained, his voice taking on the measured cadence of a seasoned instructor. "Some have lost limbs in combat operations. Others are recovering from traumatic brain injuries or burns. All of them are navigating the difficult transition from who they were to who they must now become." He turned his chair to face the group directly. "Your words today will matter more than you can imagine. These warriors are wrestling with questions of identity, purpose, and worth. They're wondering if the civilian world they defended understands or values their sacrifice. Through your reflections, you have the opportunity to show them that their service has meaning, that it has changed at least a few civilian perspectives." Derek shifted uncomfortably. "Commander, with respect, we're not anyone special. Why would they care what we have to say?" Frank smiled slightly. "Because you represent something vital to their recovery. Evidence that the civilian-military divide can be bridged, that understanding can replace ignorance, that growth is possible even from painful beginnings." He gestured toward the SUVs. "Lieutenant Commander Reeves will escort you. I'll follow in my adapted vehicle. Remember that you're entering a place of healing. Your demeanor should reflect appropriate respect for that environment." As the small convoy made its way to Naval Medical Center San Diego, the young men sat in contemplative silence. Through the windows, they could see the sprawling naval facilities that represented America's military might in the Pacific. Ships at berth, helicopters performing training operations, young sailors and Marines moving with purpose across the base. Upon arrival at the medical center, they were escorted through security with efficiency that spoke to Reeves's advanced preparation. The imposing building, with its modern medical facilities specifically designed for military casualties, created a sobering atmosphere that further reinforced the seriousness of the occasion. They were led to a rehabilitation center, where approximately 20 service members were gathered in a comfortable meeting room. Some were in wheelchairs similar to Frank's. Others stood with prosthetic limbs visible beneath shorts or rolled-up pants legs. A few showed the distinctive scarring of burn injuries or carried the less visible but equally significant burden of traumatic brain injuries. What struck the young men immediately, however, wasn't the injuries, but the atmosphere in the room. Despite the obvious challenges these warriors faced, there was no self-pity, no atmosphere of defeat. The room hummed with the determined energy of men and women facing adversity with courage, humor, and indomitable will. As Frank wheeled into the room, a ripple of recognition moved through the gathered service members. Several straightened instinctively. Others offered respectful nods or quiet greetings of "Commander." His reputation clearly preceded him. A naval doctor in uniform approached, extending her hand to Frank. "Commander Hayes, thank you for arranging this morning's session. I believe it will be valuable for our patients." "The value flows both ways, Doctor," Frank replied. "These young men have experienced an educational intervention that I hope will benefit your warriors as much as it has benefited them." The doctor's eyes flickered over the 5 civilians with professional assessment. Before she nodded, "We're ready whenever you are." The service members arranged themselves in a loose semicircle, some in chairs, others in wheelchairs, a few standing at the back. Frank positioned himself at the front of the room beside Lieutenant Commander Reeves, motioning for the 5 young men to join them. "Good morning," Frank began, addressing the gathered warriors. "My name is Commander Franklin Hayes, retired. 35 years ago, I sat where many of you are sitting now, facing an uncertain future after injuries sustained in service to our country." This simple statement created an immediate connection, a bridge of shared experience that transcended the decades between Frank's service and theirs. Yesterday, these 5 civilians participated in an educational experience regarding respect for disabled veterans, Frank continued. Today, they're here to share what they learned, in the hope that their perspectives might offer you something valuable as you navigate your own journeys. He turned to Derek. "Mr. Winters, please begin." Derek stepped forward, holding his written reflection in hands that trembled slightly. He looked out at the gathered warriors, men and women not much older than himself who had sacrificed parts of themselves for concepts he had never fully considered: duty, service, country. "My name is Derek Winters," he began, his voice initially uncertain but gaining strength as he continued. "Yesterday I did something I'm deeply ashamed of. I deliberately interfered with Commander Hayes's wheelchair on the Coronado boardwalk, endangering him and mocking his disability for my own amusement." The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees as the service members' expressions hardened. Derek swallowed hard, but continued. "What I didn't know then, what I never bothered to consider, was who Commander Hayes is, what he's accomplished, or what his disability represents. I saw only what I wanted to see. An old man in a wheelchair, someone I could disrespect without consequences." Derek glanced down at his written reflection, then set it aside, choosing instead to speak from his heart. "Yesterday, I spent 1 hour in a wheelchair. Just 1 hour. In that brief time, I encountered physical obstacles I'd never noticed before, social attitudes I'd never experienced, and limitations I'd never considered. It was humbling doesn't begin to describe it." His voice grew stronger, more passionate, but what affected me most wasn't the physical challenge. It was realizing how quickly and completely I dismissed another human being based solely on my perception of their limitations. I'd reduced Commander Hayes to his wheelchair, ignoring the lifetime of service, the leadership, the courage, and the dignity that make him who he is. Derek looked directly at the wounded warriors before him. "I can't pretend to understand what you're going through. My 1 hour in a wheelchair doesn't compare to your reality, but I can tell you that yesterday changed something fundamental in me. It showed me that strength isn't about physical power or dominance over others. It's about resilience, adaptation, and maintaining your core values despite challenges." He paused, gathering himself. "I don't expect forgiveness for my actions. What I hope is that knowing even someone as ignorant as I was can learn and change might give you some small comfort as you face a world that often doesn't understand your sacrifice." As Derek stepped back, the room remained silent for a long moment. Then a young Marine, missing both legs below the knee, spoke up from his wheelchair. "You know what's funny?" the Marine said, his voice matter-of-fact rather than bitter. "Before I lost my legs, I might have done exactly what you did. I never thought about accessibility or disability or what it means to navigate the world differently. Now it's all I think about." He wheeled himself forward slightly. "The hardest part isn't the physical stuff. It's the way some people look at you, or worse, don't look at you. Like you've become invisible, or like your worth as a person diminished along with your physical capabilities." The Marine gestured toward Frank. "Men like the commander show us it doesn't have to be that way, that we can still serve, Still, lead, still matter. Your experience yesterday, that's actually valuable to hear. It tells us change is possible. Each of the other young men took their turns, sharing reflections that revealed similar transformations. They spoke of newfound awareness, of altered perspectives, of lessons that had penetrated far deeper than expected. Their words weren't polished or eloquent, but their sincerity was unmistakable. What followed was something Reeves had not scripted, but Frank had hoped for: a genuine dialogue between the wounded warriors and the 5 civilians. The service members began sharing their own experiences, the daily challenges they faced, the attitudes they encountered, the moments of both frustration and triumph in their recovery journeys. A Navy corpsman with severe burn scars covering half his face described the way children stared and adults averted their eyes. "The kids are just curious," he said with a slight smile. "It's the adults who haven't learned how to see past the scars." A female Army helicopter pilot with a prosthetic arm demonstrated how she'd adapted to her new reality, showing the custom modifications that allowed her to pursue certification as a civilian flight instructor. "Adaptation isn't surrender," she explained, "it's evolution." As the conversation deepened, the artificial barriers between the two groups began to dissolve. The wounded warriors weren't performing inspiration for civilian consumption. They were sharing authentic experiences with people newly capable of understanding. The young men weren't offering empty platitudes. They were listening with genuine interest and engagement. Frank observed this emerging connection with quiet satisfaction. This was the true purpose of his educational intervention. Not just to punish or humiliate 5 thoughtless young men, but to create a bridge of understanding that might extend far beyond this room. After nearly 2 hours, the naval doctor signaled that the session needed to conclude, as many of the service members had therapy appointments. As the group began to disperse, several warriors approached Derek and his friends, continuing conversations and exchanging contact information. The female pilot pulled Frank aside, her expression thoughtful. "Commander, how did you arrange this? These civilians, they're different from the usual visitors we get." Frank smiled slightly. "Let's just say they received an accelerated education in perspective." "Well, it worked," she replied. "Most civilians who visit either pity us or put us on pedestals. Neither helps. These guys, they just listened, really listened." As they prepared to leave, Derek approached Frank once more. "Commander Hayes, I want to ask you something, if that's okay." Frank nodded, giving him permission to continue. "Yesterday, Lieutenant Commander Reeves told us about your injuries, about the operation where you were wounded saving his grandfather." Derek hesitated. "But you never mentioned it yourself. You never tried to make us feel worse by telling us what you'd sacrificed." Frank considered his response carefully. "Mr. Winters, in my experience, true respect can't be demanded. It must be earned, not through tales of past glory, but through present dignity. The way we conduct ourselves each day says more than any war story ever could." He gestured toward the departing wounded warriors. "Those men and women aren't defined by how they were injured, but by how they respond to those injuries. Their value isn't measured in lost limbs or combat decorations, but in their continued commitment to growth, service, and excellence." Frank fixed Derek with his penetrating gaze. "The same is true for you. You won't be defined by your mistake on the boardwalk, but by what you choose to become because of the lessons you've learned from it." As they exited the medical center, stepping into the bright California sunshine, Lieutenant Commander Reeves directed the young men toward the waiting vehicles. Before Derek could join them, Frank motioned him aside. "There's one more component to your education," Frank said, handing Derek a business card. The naval base runs a volunteer program that pairs civilians with recovering service members for community reintegration activities. Everything from adaptive sports to simple outings that help them navigate public spaces with their new challenges. Derek looked at the card, then back at Frank, with dawning understanding. "Consider it part of your continuing education," Frank said. 6 months of volunteer service, not as punishment but as opportunity. Lieutenant Commander Reeves will oversee your participation and provide regular reports. "Yes, sir," Derek replied without hesitation. "Thank you, sir." As they drove back toward Coronado, the young men were quieter than before, processing all they had seen and heard. The SUVs wound through the busy streets of San Diego, passing civilians, going about their daily routines, oblivious to the profound transformations occurring inside the vehicles. When they reached Frank's cottage, the young men disembarked, gathering on his deck one final time. The morning's experiences had deepened yesterday's lessons, converting theoretical understanding into emotional commitment. "Gentlemen," Frank said, addressing them from his wheelchair, "our formal educational intervention concludes here. Lieutenant Commander Reeves will maintain contact regarding your volunteer commitments, but my direct involvement ends today." He surveyed their faces, noting the genuine changes in their expressions, their postures, their entire demeanor. "However, I want to leave you with one final thought." Frank wheeled himself to the railing of his deck, gesturing toward the boardwalk where their encounter had begun. "Every day we make choices about how we see others, whether we recognize their full humanity or reduce them to superficial characteristics. Those choices define us more than they define those we encounter." He turned back to face them directly. "Your actions yesterday reflected one set of values. Your potential actions tomorrow reflect something entirely different. The gap between those two realities is where growth happens." Derek stepped forward, speaking for the group. "Commander Hayes, we can't undo what we did, but we can promise. It won't happen again, not to you, not to anyone. What we learned here, it goes beyond wheelchairs or disabilities. It's about seeing people, really seeing them." Frank nodded, accepting the commitment. "That's all anyone can ask. Now, Lieutenant Commander Reeves has arranged transportation to return you to your vehicles at the marina. I believe you all have volunteer orientations to schedule." As the young men filed off his deck, each offering a respectful goodbye, Frank watched them with the experienced eye of a leader who had evaluated character throughout his career. Their transformation appeared genuine, not the superficial compliance of those merely avoiding consequences, but the deeper change that comes from altered perspective. When they had departed, Reeves remained behind briefly. "Mission accomplished, sir?" he asked, a slight smile breaking his professional demeanor. "Phase 1 completed successfully," Frank replied. "The real mission continues as they integrate these lessons into their daily lives. Your continued oversight will be essential." Reeves nodded. "Already arranged, sir. Monthly check-ins, documentation of their volunteer hours, feedback from the medical center staff will maintain appropriate accountability." "Not just accountability, Jason," Frank corrected gently. "Mentorship. These young men don't just need monitoring, they need guidance to sustain and build upon what they've learned." "Understood, Commander." Reeves glanced toward the departing SUVs. "Do you think it will last? Once they're back in their normal lives, their usual social circles?" Frank considered the question thoughtfully. True change isn't measured in days or weeks, but in the accumulated choices of a lifetime. Some lessons penetrate deeply enough to alter those choices permanently. I believe we've provided such a lesson. He smiled slightly. Besides, the volunteer program will reinforce everything they've learned. There's nothing like regular exposure to service members adapting to life-altering injuries to maintain perspective. After Reeves departed, Frank wheeled himself into his study, reflecting on the past 24 hours. He opened his laptop and began typing an email to his son on deployment. "Thomas, the situation we discussed has been resolved with what I believe to be optimal outcomes. Lieutenant Commander Reeves and his team performed admirably. 5 young civilians received an education they sorely needed, and 20 wounded warriors had the opportunity to share their experiences with newly receptive listeners. It reminds me of something your grandfather once told me. Leadership isn't about creating followers, it's about creating more leaders. Today, I witnessed the beginning of that process in some unlikely candidates. Give my best to your crew. Stay safe, Dad." As Frank sent the email, he glanced at the photograph on his desk. Himself as a young SEAL officer standing beside his own mentor, the commander who had shaped his understanding of leadership, service, and dignity. The circle continued, wisdom passing from generation to generation, sometimes through unexpected channels. Outside his window, the boardwalk teemed with life, joggers, tourists, locals enjoying the perfect weather. Among them rolled an elderly woman in a wheelchair, navigating the same path where Frank had been accosted. As he watched, a group of young people ahead of her noticed her approach, immediately making space, offering respectful nods as she passed. Small changes rippling outward, the true measure of education. Frank closed his laptop and wheeled himself onto his deck, breathing in the salt air, at peace with the knowledge that today, in his own way, he had continued to serve. 6 months later, as autumn painted Coronado with golden light, Frank's morning routine remained unchanged. Coffee on his deck, newspaper methodically read section by section, and his daily roll along the boardwalk, a practice in both physical maintenance and quiet observation of the world he had long served. What had changed, however, was the community around him. The wheelchair incident, as locals had come to call it, had rippled outward in ways neither Frank nor Lieutenant Commander Reeves could have fully anticipated. The story had spread through Coronado's tight-knit community, evolving with each, telling but preserving its essential truth. Respect for veterans was not optional, and actions had consequences. Frank wheeled himself along his usual route, noting the subtle transformations that had occurred since that spring morning. The boardwalk now featured improved accessibility ramps at every junction. Restaurants had widened doorways and pathways between tables. Shop owners stepped outside to greet him by name, no longer seeing just an elderly man in a wheelchair, but recognizing Commander Hayes, whose quiet dignity had catalyzed unexpected change. As he approached the marina where it had all begun, Frank noticed a gathering of people near the sandbar. A banner stretched across the entrance read, "Veterans Adaptive Sports Program, 6-month anniversary celebration." Below it stood Derek Winters, dressed in a polo shirt bearing the program's logo, deep in conversation with the female Army helicopter pilot from the medical center, now wearing her prosthetic arm with confidence as she demonstrated kayaking equipment modified for single-arm operation. Frank paused at a discreet distance, observing without interrupting. Derek's volunteer commitment had evolved far beyond the required hours. Working with the Naval Medical Center's rehabilitation team, he had leveraged his family's resources and business connections to establish a non-profit organization supporting adaptive recreational activities for wounded warriors. What had begun as mandated community service had transformed into genuine vocation. Derek's 4 friends had remained involved as well, each finding their own ways to contribute. One providing legal assistance for the non-profit's establishment, another designing a website and social media presence, the third coordinating transportation for participants, and the fourth documenting the program through photography and videography. As Frank watched, A group of wounded warriors arrived, some familiar faces from the medical center, others new to the program. Among them was a young Marine in a wheelchair remarkably similar to Frank's own. The Marine navigated with the awkward determination of someone still adapting to his new reality. Derek spotted the Marine's struggle with a slight incline and immediately moved to assist, not by taking control of the wheelchair, but by offering quiet guidance on technique, demonstrating the proper approach to the ramp's angle. The interaction showed neither condescension nor excessive deference, just the natural respect of one human being helping another. The scene confirmed what Frank had hoped, but could not guarantee, that the lessons delivered through educational intervention had taken root in fertile soil, growing into something authentic and sustainable. As Frank prepared to continue his route, Derek glanced up and noticed him. After a brief word to his colleagues, Derek jogged over, his face lighting up with genuine pleasure. "Commander Hayes, I was hoping you might come by today," he said, extending his hand in greeting. "We're celebrating 6 months of the program. Would you consider joining us? Many of the participants know your role in how this all started. They'd be honored to meet you." Frank accepted the handshake, noting the confident but respectful grip. So different from the entitled young man who had shouldered past his wheelchair half a year earlier. "I'd be happy to join you, Mr. Winters," Frank replied, "though I'm merely an observer in what you've built here." Derek shook his head, smiling. "Hardly, sir. You're the foundation of everything we've accomplished. Without your unique approach to community education, none of this would exist." As they moved toward the gathering, Derek briefed Frank on the program's progress. What had begun with 5 reluctant volunteers and 20 wounded warriors had expanded to include over 50 regular participants and a network of community supporters. Local businesses provided venues and equipment. Medical professionals offered guidance on adaptive techniques. Civilians volunteered as companions for recreational outings. "The most surprising outcome," Derek explained, "has been the impact on the civilian volunteers. They sign up thinking they're going to help the disabled vets, but they quickly realize they're receiving far more than they're giving. The perspective shift is remarkable to witness." Frank nodded, recognizing the wisdom in Derek's observation. Service has that effect. It reveals our common humanity beneath superficial differences. As they reached the gathering, a subtle ripple of recognition moved through the crowd. Those in uniform offered respectful nods. Those who recognized Frank's significance whispered explanations to others. Without fanfare or announcement, the group naturally created space for Frank to join them. The female pilot, whose name tag identified her as Captain Sarah Mitchell, approached with a warm smile. "Commander Hayes, it's good to see you again. Your educational project has grown quite impressively." Her tone carried a knowing humor, suggesting she understood more about the origins of Derek's involvement than was publicly acknowledged. "Captain Mitchell," Frank greeted her, "I see you're providing leadership for this operation." She laughed, a bright, genuine sound. "Someone has to keep these civilians in line. They have enthusiasm, but needed tactical guidance." She gestured to her prosthetic arm, now adorned with a custom-painted design featuring naval aviation insignia. "Besides, this gives me an opportunity to show what's possible, to be the example I needed when I was first injured." The young Marine whom Frank had observed earlier wheeled himself over, coming to a respectful stop and offering a seated version of attention. "Commander Hayes, sir. Lance Corporal Miguel Rodriguez, sir. It's an honor to meet you." Frank returned, the greeting with equal respect. "The honor is mine, Lance Corporal. How are you finding the program?" Rodriguez's eyes flickered briefly to his wheelchair before meeting Frank's gaze directly. "Life-changing, sir. Not just the activities, but seeing someone like you, sir. Someone who's lived with this for years and still He searched for the right words. Still commands respect, still makes a difference. Frank recognized the struggle in the young Marine's eyes, the same battle he had fought decades earlier when his own injuries had first confined him to a wheelchair. The search for identity beyond physical capability, for purpose beyond traditional service. Lance Corporal, may I offer an observation? Frank asked. Of course, sir. You speak of your wheelchair as a limitation, and in some ways it is. But in my experience, it's also a powerful filter. Rodriguez looked puzzled. A filter, sir? Frank nodded. It filters out those who can only see the chair and not the person in it. It reveals with perfect clarity who possesses the wisdom to recognize true character beyond physical appearance. He gestured toward the gathered community. The people who remain in your life now, who see you for who you are, rather than what you've lost. They are your real community, more authentic, more valuable than what existed before. The young Marine considered this perspective, his expression thoughtful. I never thought of it that way, sir. It took me some time well, Frank admitted. But eventually, I recognized that my wheelchair didn't diminish my ability to serve. It simply transformed how that service would manifest. Their conversation was interrupted as Derek called for everyone's attention, inviting the gathering to move to the waterfront where several adaptive kayaks were prepared for demonstration. As the group shifted, Frank found himself approached by Lieutenant Commander Reeves, now in civilian clothes, but still carrying himself with unmistakable military bearing. "Commander," Reeves greeted him quietly, "I thought you might be here today." "Your monitoring operation continues, I see," Frank replied with a slight smile. Reeves chuckled. "Less monitoring these days, more marveling. When you proposed this educational intervention 6 months ago, I expected compliance. I didn't expect this." He gestured toward the thriving community program unfolding before them. The best leadership creates outcomes that surpass the leader's original vision, Frank said. Something I believe your grandfather once taught both of us. They watched as Derek competently guided the group through safety procedures for the adaptive kayaking demonstration. His formerly arrogant demeanor had been replaced by genuine confidence, the quiet authority of someone who had found meaningful purpose. "He's applied to Officer Candidate School," Reeves mentioned casually. "Naval Special Warfare has taken an interest in his application, given his work with wounded warriors. He's requesting a recommendation from you." Frank raised an eyebrow. An interesting development, from entitled civilian to aspiring officer in 6 months. His psychological evaluation showed remarkable maturity development, Reeves continued. The evaluator specifically noted his capacity for empathy and his ability to lead diverse groups, qualities directly attributed to his experiences following the boardwalk incident. Frank considered this information thoughtfully. And the others, his friends, similarly transformed, though along different paths. One is pursuing medical school with a focus on rehabilitative medicine. Another is studying accessible design architecture. The remaining 2 are working with veteran service organizations in various capacities. Reeves paused. "Your educational intervention appears to have been extraordinarily effective, sir." "The credit belongs to them," Frank replied. "They could have chosen resentment rather than growth. They could have completed their mandatory service hours and returned to their previous lives unchanged." "But they didn't," Reeves observed. "No, they didn't," Frank agreed. "Which tells us something important about human potential and the power of consequential education." As the adaptive kayaking demonstration began, Frank and Reeves joined the spectators along the waterfront. The sight was remarkable. Wounded warriors with various disabilities maneuvering specially modified kayaks with increasing confidence. their faces showing the unique blend of concentration and exhilaration that comes from reclaiming physical capability. Family members watched from shore, some wiping away tears as they witnessed their loved ones experiencing freedom of movement many had thought permanently lost. Community members cheered supportive encouragement, no longer seeing the disabilities, but recognizing the determination and courage on display. One young boy, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, stood transfixed as Captain Mitchell demonstrated single-arm kayaking techniques with fluid expertise. As she returned to shore, the boy approached her with wide-eyed wonder. "That was awesome," he exclaimed. "Your robot arm is so cool. Can I have one too?" His mother began to apologize, embarrassed by her son's direct approach. But Captain Mitchell laughed warmly. "It's not exactly a robot arm," she explained, kneeling to the boy's level. "It's a prosthetic. And you know what? When I first got it, I was scared and sad, but now I think it's pretty cool too." She demonstrated how the mechanical hand operated, answering the boy's enthusiastic questions with patient good humor. The interaction drew smiles from observers, a perfect embodiment of the program's broader impact, breaking down barriers of discomfort and ignorance through direct, honest engagement. As the demonstration concluded, Derek organized a small ceremony, recognizing key contributors to the program's success. Frank noted with approval that equal emphasis was placed on the wounded warriors who had shared their experiences and the civilian volunteers who had provided support, each recognized as essential partners rather than helpers and recipients. When the formal proceedings ended, the gathering transitioned to a casual barbecue on the beach. Adaptive equipment allowed wounded warriors to navigate the sand. Community members mingled without the awkwardness that often characterized civilian military interactions. Derek approached Frank once more, this time accompanied by his father, a distinguished-looking man whose resemblance to his son was evident in his features, if not his demeanor. "Commander Hayes," Derek said, "I'd like to introduce my father, Richard Winters." The elder Winters extended his hand. "Commander, it's an honor to finally meet you. I've heard a great deal about you over these past months." Frank accepted the handshake, assessing the man who had raised Derek. "Mr. Winters, your son has accomplished something remarkable with this program." Richard Winters nodded, his expression complex. Pride in his son's achievements, tempered by lingering embarrassment over the incident that had catalyzed them. "Yes, he has. Though I confess, when I first learned about what happened on the boardwalk, I was." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Disappointed doesn't begin to cover it. I was prepared to leverage whatever connections necessary to minimize the consequences." Frank remained silent, allowing the man to continue. "Derek wouldn't allow it," Richard admitted with unexpected respect in his tone. "He insisted on accepting full responsibility and completing whatever educational intervention you and Lieutenant Commander Reeves deemed appropriate. It was perhaps the first time he'd ever refused my assistance." Derek shifted slightly, uncomfortable with the conversation, but allowing it to unfold. "The changes I've seen in my son these past 6 months," Richard continued, "they've been profound, not just in his activities or his career aspirations, but in his fundamental character. Whatever method you employed, Commander, you have my deepest gratitude." Frank acknowledged this with a slight nod. "Your son made his own choices, Mr. Winters. We merely provided the opportunity for him to see beyond his previous perspective." As Richard was called away to meet other program participants, Derek remained, his expression thoughtful. "I've been meaning to ask you something, Commander," he said. "Something that's puzzled me since that first day." "Go ahead," Frank encouraged. "You could have responded in so many ways when I knocked your wheelchair. You could have reported us to the police. You could have sued my family. You could have gone to the media." Derek paused. "Instead, you orchestrated something that ultimately benefited not just us, but all these wounded warriors and the broader community. How did you know that would work? Frank considered the question carefully. I didn't know with certainty, he admitted, but in my years commanding special operations, I learned to assess character quickly, to distinguish between those who do wrong from genuine malice and those who do wrong from ignorance or misguided priorities. He gestured toward the gathering. What I saw in you and your friends that day was entitlement and ignorance, not inherent cruelty. And ignorance can be addressed through education if delivered with sufficient impact. Derek smiled slightly at the understatement. The impact was definitely sufficient, sir. As for benefiting the wounded warriors, Frank continued, that was always the primary objective. Your education was important, but secondary to creating something meaningful for those navigating the challenges of injury and recovery. Like turning an enemy into an ally, Derek observed. Not exactly, Frank corrected. More like recognizing potential allies disguised by temporary misalignment of values. The best commanders don't just neutralize opposition, they convert it into support. Their conversation was interrupted as Lance Corporal Rodriguez approached, accompanied by several other wounded warriors. Commander Hayes, sir, we were hoping you might share some of your experiences with adaptive techniques. Many of us are still new to this, and your insights would be invaluable. Frank recognized the request for what it was, not just a desire for practical advice, but a search for reassurance that fulfilling lives remained possible despite physical limitations. It was a question he had once asked his own mentors, in different words, but with the same underlying uncertainty. I'd be honored, Lance Corporal, Frank replied, though I suspect Captain Mitchell's techniques are considerably more advanced than mine. As Frank joined the group of wounded warriors, Derek watched with growing understanding. The educational intervention hadn't ended 6 months ago on Frank's deck. It continued through this program, through every interaction that challenged assumptions about disability and capability, through every moment that replaced ignorance with understanding. The afternoon stretched into evening, the gathering illuminated by tiki torches and string lights as darkness fell. Conversations deepened, connections strengthened, and plans for expanding the program took shape. What had begun as 5 reluctant young men performing mandated community service had evolved into a vital support network that served both wounded warriors and the civilian community that received them. As Frank prepared to depart, he paused to survey the scene one final time. Lance Corporal Rodriguez was demonstrating wheelchair techniques to an interested group of civilians. Captain Mitchell was deep in conversation with Derek's architect friend about designs for more accessible public spaces. Derek himself was coordinating with local business owners about upcoming events, moving with the natural authority of someone who had found his true calling. Lieutenant Commander Reeves appeared at Frank's side. Mission accomplished, Commander. Frank smiled slightly. Mission expanded and ongoing, Lieutenant Commander, as the best missions often do. As he wheeled himself along the boardwalk toward home, Frank reflected on the long arc of service that had defined his life. From the jungles of Vietnam to classified operations in distant waters to this unexpected final chapter, the forms had changed, but the essence remained constant. Leadership, mentorship, the steady insistence that actions have consequences, that respect must be given to be received, that dignity transcends physical capability. The boardwalk that had once been the site of disrespect had transformed into a pathway of connection and understanding. The community that had witnessed his humiliation now participated in celebrating resilience and adaptation. The young man who had mocked his disability now led efforts to support those facing similar challenges. Frank reached his cottage as the last light faded from the sky, the sounds of continued celebration carrying faintly across the water. Inside, he found an envelope that had been delivered during his absence. Opening it, he discovered a formal letter requesting his recommendation for Derek's officer candidate school application, along with a handwritten note. Commander Hayes, before you consider this request, I want you to know that I understand the weight of a recommendation from someone of your stature. I don't presume to deserve it based on 6 months of service, which merely begins to balance the scale of my previous actions. What I hope you'll consider is not who I was on that boardwalk, but who I'm committed to becoming, someone who upholds the values of respect, service, and dignity that you've demonstrated throughout your career. Whatever your decision, please know that the lesson you taught me that day, that true strength lies in how we treat others, especially those we perceive as vulnerable, will guide me for the rest of my life. With deepest respect, Derek Winters. Frank set the letter aside, knowing his response would require careful consideration. The transformation he had witnessed was remarkable, but naval special warfare demanded the highest standards of character and leadership. His recommendation would carry significant weight, opening doors that would otherwise remain closed. As he prepared for sleep, Frank's gaze fell on the photograph of his own mentor, the commander who had seen potential in a young, sometimes arrogant SEAL officer decades earlier, who had guided rather than dismissed him after moments of poor judgment. The circle continued, wisdom passing from generation to generation, sometimes through unexpected channels, leadership creating more leaders, service inspiring more service, respect engendering respect. In the morning, Frank would compose his response, measured, honest, acknowledging both the remarkable growth he had witnessed and the continued journey that lay ahead. For tonight, he rested in the quiet satisfaction of knowing that his own service continued in ways he could never have anticipated when his injuries first confined him to a wheelchair. The true measure of leadership, after all, was not found in personal achievements, but in the achievements it inspired in others. By that standard, as he drifted towards sleep, Frank knew his mission had been accomplished indeed. If you believe that respect for our veterans, especially those who bear the visible and invisible scars of service, is a sacred duty that transcends politics and social divisions, remember this. Sometimes the most powerful response to disrespect isn't outrage or vengeance, but education, delivered with precision and purpose. The transformation of heart and mind that follows can ripple outward, touching lives far beyond the initial encounter, creating communities of understanding where once there was only ignorance. The story of Commander Hayes and the 5 young men reminds us that true strength lies not in physical capability, but in dignity maintained despite challenges, that leadership continues long after formal authority ends, and that the most meaningful victories aren't won through force but through changed perspectives and awakened conscience. In a world that often seems to have forgotten the value of respect, perhaps we all need occasional educational interventions to remind us of our common humanity and our obligations to one another, especially to those who have sacrificed so much in service to us all. 3 years had passed since that fateful morning on the Coronado boardwalk. Commander Franklin Hayes, now 88, sat in his upgraded titanium wheelchair on the deck of his cottage, watching the sunrise paint the Pacific in shades of gold and amber. His daily routine remained largely unchanged. Coffee savored slowly, newspaper methodically read, quiet contemplation of the naval base across the bay where generations of warriors had been forged, including those whose lives had intersected with his in unexpected ways. But today was different. Today marked the commissioning of a new officer in the United States Navy, an event Frank had been invited to attend as a guest of honor. The invitation, printed on formal Navy letterhead, rested on the small table beside him, alongside a photograph taken at officer candidate school graduation several months earlier. Derek Winters in his dress whites, standing tall and proud, his transformation from entitled civilian to naval officer complete. Frank's recommendation had indeed opened doors, but Derek had walked through them on his own merit, distinguishing himself through the grueling challenges of OCS with the same determination he had brought to the veterans program. Lieutenant. Commander Reeves had kept Frank informed of Derek's progress, reporting with increasing respect on the young man's performance and character development. The adaptive veterans program that had begun as mandated community service had flourished beyond anyone's expectations, expanding to 3 additional locations along the California coast and serving hundreds of wounded warriors annually. Derek's 4 friends remained involved, each having found their own paths to meaningful service. The architecture student now designing accessible facilities for veteran rehabilitation centers, the pre-med student completing his residency in physical rehabilitation medicine, the others leveraging their skills and resources to support veteran reintegration in various capacities. As Frank prepared for the commissioning ceremony, he reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had sprung from a single moment of disrespect and its carefully calibrated consequences. What might have ended with punitive justice had instead blossomed into transformative justice, creating ripples of positive change that continued to expand outward. His reverie was interrupted by the arrival of his son Thomas, now a captain commanding a guided missile destroyer, home briefly between deployments to escort his father to the ceremony. "Ready for the big day, Dad?" Thomas asked, his weathered face, so like Frank's at that age, creased in a warm smile. "Just about," Frank replied, wheeling himself inside to collect his dress blue uniform, still immaculately maintained despite his retirement years. Though regulations didn't require it, Frank felt the occasion merited the formal acknowledgement of his service and rank. As Thomas drove them toward the naval base, he glanced at his father with undisguised admiration. "You know, what you did with those kids, that was masterful leadership. Converting potential adversaries into allies through education rather than punishment. We study similar concepts in modern asymmetric warfare doctrine." Frank smiled slightly. "Hardly warfare, son." "No?" Thomas raised an eyebrow. "You identified a threat, developed intelligence, mobilized appropriate resources, executed a precision intervention, and achieved your strategic objectives with minimal collateral damage. Sounds like a special operation to me." Frank chuckled at his son's analysis. "I suppose old habits persist, though I suspect Lieutenant Commander Reeves might deserve the majority of the credit for tactical execution." They arrived at the ceremony venue, a historic section of the naval base overlooking the same waters where Frank had once trained young SEALs decades earlier. The space was filled with naval officers in dress whites, family members in formal attire, and notably, a significant contingent of wounded warriors from the Adaptive Veterans Program, their presence a testament to the bridges built between civilian life and military service. As Frank wheeled into position in the area reserved for honored guests, he was approached by Richard Winters, Derek's father, whose demeanor had transformed as profoundly as his son's over the intervening years. "Commander Hayes," Richard greeted him warmly, "today wouldn't be possible without you. Not just Derek's commissioning, but the men he's become." Frank accepted the acknowledgement with a modest nod. "Your son made his own choices, Mr. Winters. I merely provided an opportunity for perspective adjustment." Richard smiled knowingly, "A perspective adjustment delivered with SEAL precision, from what I understand." He glanced toward where Derek stood with the other commissioning candidates, resplendent in his new uniform. "He's requested the Naval Special Warfare community, you know, inspired by a certain commander's example." Before Frank could respond, the ceremony began. As tradition dictated, each new officer had selected a mentor, someone whose influence had shaped their path to service, to deliver their first salute. When Derek's name was called, he stepped forward with the crisp precision of his training, facing the gathered assembly with quiet confidence. "For my first salute," Derek announced clearly, "I have asked Commander Franklin Hayes, United States Navy, retired, to do me the honor." A murmur of appreciation ran through the crowd as Frank wheeled himself forward. With the dignity that had defined his entire career, Frank straightened in his wheelchair, raising his hand in a perfect salute to the newly commissioned Ensign Winters. Derek returned the salute with equal precision, his eyes meeting Frank's with profound respect and gratitude. In that moment, visible to all witnesses, was the tangible connection between generations of service, the passing of values, traditions, and responsibilities from one era to the next. Following the ceremony, as guests mingled during the reception, Lance Corporal Rodriguez, now a civilian rehabilitation specialist working with newly injured veterans, approached Frank. "Your educational intervention has gone viral, Commander," he said with a grin, gesturing toward the diverse gathering. "What began with 5 entitled kids and a wheelchair incident has become something none of us could have imagined." Frank surveyed the scene thoughtfully. Naval officers conversing with wounded warriors, civilian volunteers planning new program initiatives, families celebrating not just military service, but the broader concept of community responsibility. The best education creates outcomes that exceed the educator's vision, Frank observed. Rodriguez nodded. "The ripple effect continues, sir. 3 more adaptive programs launching in different states this year. A congressional hearing on improved accessibility standards for public spaces. Corporate sponsorships for adaptive equipment development." As the reception continued, Frank found himself approached by a young woman in naval uniform, a new recruit who introduced herself as Petty Officer Chen. "Commander Hayes," she said respectfully, "I wanted to thank you personally. I joined the Navy because of the Adaptive Veterans Program. My brother lost his leg in Afghanistan, and watching him regain his confidence through the program showed me what real service looks like." Throughout the afternoon, similar stories emerged, lives touched directly and indirectly by the chain of events Frank had set in motion 3 years earlier. What had begun as a response to disrespect had evolved into a movement of respect, understanding, and community integration. As the celebration wound down, Derek sought Frank out once more, now officially Ensign Winters, with all the responsibilities that rank entailed. "I ship out for initial training next week," he said, standing at respectful ease before Frank's wheelchair. "Before I go, I wanted to ask if you have any final guidance, sir." Frank considered the young man thoughtfully, no longer the entitled bully who had knocked his wheelchair, but not yet the officer he would become through experience and service. "Remember that leadership isn't about rank or authority," Frank said finally. "It's about influence and example. The true measure of your success won't be found in your fitness reports or promotion timeline, but in the development of those you lead and the legacy you leave in each command." Derek nodded, absorbing the wisdom with genuine appreciation. "And if I encounter my own boardwalk bullies, sir, those who need perspective adjustment?" Frank smiled slightly. "Education is always preferable to punishment, Ensign. But the delivery method must be calibrated to the student's receptivity. Some lessons require memorable emphasis." As the gathering dispersed, Frank remained briefly on the ceremonial grounds, gazing out at the Pacific where he had served for so many years. The wheelchair that had once seemed a limitation had become an unexpected instrument of teaching, a platform from which he had delivered perhaps his most enduring lesson. Thomas approached, ready to drive his father home. "Successful mission, Dad?" Frank nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. Mission complete, though the effects will continue long after we're gone. The best operations always do. As they departed, Frank glanced back at the naval base, where new generations of sailors were preparing to carry forward the traditions of service, sacrifice, and respect he had upheld throughout his career. Among them now was a young officer whose path to service had begun with a moment of disrespect, followed by 18 minutes of precisely calibrated education. A reminder that true strength lies not in domination, but in the courage to change, to grow, and ultimately to serve. Something greater than oneself. If you believe in the power of transformative education, in the possibility of genuine change, and in our collective responsibility to uphold respect for those who have served, remember Commander Hayes and his unexpected final mission. In a world often quick to punish but slow to teach, perhaps we would all do well to consider what moments of disrespect in our own lives might be transformed with proper intervention into opportunities for growth, service, and lasting positive change. The wheelchair incident had ended, but its legacy would roll forward through countless lives touched by its lessons. Proof that even our most difficult moments can become, in the right hands, the foundation for unexpected blessings. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload. From us,